All right.
Quickly.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Happy New Year and happy almost 4 years of Daf Yomi. If you've been with us since the beginning of this cycle, tomorrow is the 4 year anniversary of our start. So we are well over the halfway hump. It is lovely to see you this morning. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. This is my Jewish Learning's Daf Yomi Week in Lightning Review. And we are delighted to be joined this morning by Dr. Yardena Osband. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so when thinking, it's great to see all of you and some familiar faces. So when thinking about what to do for this week's Daf Yomi Roundup, I'm not going to touch the new parak. The new parak is very confusing that we started 2 days ago, Maruba. But I wanted to do the end of the sixth parak, which talks a lot about fire and sort of the separate category of damages by fire. There's 6 Mishnahs that the Gemara will discuss. So I want to see if we can be super speedy and go through all 6 Mishnahs today and do a little bit of Gemara on each Mishnah as well. I don't know that I have an overall total theme here. Sometimes I try to do a theme, but I think just thinking about fire and the type of damage that it causes and the responsibility we have with fire is an interesting topic. So I'm going to share my screen quickly and we will get started. So the first Mishnah that we see is on 59b. And it reads as follows: Hamagdish b'toch sadeh chavero shelo b'reshut v'achlatan behemato shel baal hasadeh patur. And I'm even reading from the wrong Mishnah. Okay. Hasholech adbei rabbi yachli resha teva katan patur b'dinei adam v'chayev b'dinei shamayim. Shilach b'yad pikeach ha'pikeach chayav. So it's very interesting how the Mishnah begins, or the Gemara begins discussing this whole topic of fire with this sort of weird introductory Mishnah. And the Mishnah reads as follows: somebody who sends a fire, in other words, you take a burning object, you put it somewhere, and you give it to a cheresh, right? A cheresh is the halachic category of a deaf mute. I could spend our whole half hour just talking about the category of cheresh and shota, but I'm not going to. I don't like the English translation of shota that they give here as imbecile. Shota is basically a person who seems to have some type of impaired cognitive status and doesn't have the same mental status that we consider a person to have, to sort of be cognizant of the decisions they make and the ramifications of their actions. So the word imbecile really doesn't quite do that justice. Or katan, right, which is a minor, because that's a person, a minor is somebody also we say is not necessarily responsible for their actions. They are patur b'dinei adam v'chayev b'dinei shamayim. So this is a very interesting concept that I think is actually the first time we've seen in the Gemara. It does come up in other areas, which says, the Mishnah tells us that they are, according to the human laws, right, they are exempt for any damage caused by that fire. However, by the court of heaven, right, they actually are chayav. They actually are liable to something. And we don't have the time to go through it now, but anyone who's interested sort of afterward, it's worth it to sort of Google this phrase and see where else it comes up in the Gemara. But this whole concept that sort of like by our own human civil courts, we could be patur. We're not actually liable for something. We don't have to pay damages. And yet in sort of God's court, God's view of what we should have done or not done, we are actually liable. And then shilech biyad pikeach, but if pikeach is the category of sort of a halachically competent person, right? This is a person who's going to be fully responsible for anything that they do. Ha-pikeach chayav. The pikeach will be chayav if he has fire with him and it damages somebody else's property. Echad heviya ta'or v'echad heviya ta'itzim. Let's say one person brings the fire and one person brings the wood, right? The wood is going to cause the flammable substance that will cause the fire to spread. The person who brings the eitzim, that is the person who's chayav. In other words, the person who really causes the fire to spread is going to be chayav. And so that's also a very interesting point about fire, right? It's not the person who owns the fire or starts the fire, but it's the person responsible for the fire spreading. Right? However, if we have a flammable substance around and then somebody brings the fire, okay, in that case, the person who brings the fire is going to be chayav. So what the Mishnah seems to be saying here is that it's really the person who ends up being sort of responsible for how it spreads, right? So in other words, you're allowed to have a pile of wood lying around, okay? But you do need to be careful that your pile of wood is not in close proximity to a fire, okay? And if there's a pile of wood lying around, you need to be careful that you're not starting a fire in a place where that pile of wood could actually could catch on fire. Let's say somebody comes and fans the fire, okay? So they're not bringing the fire, they're not actually bringing the wood itself, but they just bring, they fan it, right? They add, wind, oxygen to it, okay? They are chayav. Let's say the wind fanned it, kulam pturin. Then we actually say that everybody is exempt. And so I think what's interesting about this category, right? Up until now, we've been talking about things like a shore, right? And other types of animals, which sort of, we say they don't, obviously they don't have the same, they're not cognitively the same as humans, but we know by their nature that they can cause, some type of damage. We have the category of the boar, right? We have the category of humans who we say are just, the boar, is the pit, which sort of is something that's just stationary, not there. It's dug by a human. It doesn't necessarily do something active, but just by its being there, it can cause damages. We have humans, which was another category, which we say humans by nature are always muad, they're always damagers. And then we have this category of fire where the Mishnah basically acknowledges that there are so many different factors involved in determining how we decide who's chayav or who's patur when it comes to fire, right? Who's handling the fire? Are they somebody who's competent enough to understand the danger of fire? Who brings the materials to actually cause the fire to spread, right? Fire by itself is not dangerous. It's more its proximity to something that's flammable, and the order in which that's brought will determine who is actually liable. And finally, the end of the Mishnah basically acknowledges that, even if you don't touch the fire, you don't have anything to do with the fire, you could do something, right, by fanning it that could cause it to spread. And yet also there's a piece of how fire spreads, which can also just sort of be like what we would call an act of God, right? The wind comes and it spreads it, and that has nothing to do with anything that anybody else did. So fire seems to be sort of this unique category that has many different factors involved, right? Just from at least the way the Mishnah presents it, that can impact who is chayav and who is patur, or is there even a case where nobody is liable at all, right? That would be the case of actually the wind. Okay, so we'll look at a little bit of the Gemara that's on here, okay? And the Gemara here says the following, okay? Libataha ruach kulam pturin. Okay, so we said if the wind fanned the flames, everybody is exempt. Tanu Rabbanan. All right, so we learned in a brisa. Liba v'libataha ruach im yesh bilibuyo kedei l'bato chaya v'im lav patur. So this brisa teaches us the following. Okay, in the case where somebody fanned the flame and at the same time there was wind. Okay, this obviously makes sense. The Gemara would find this would be a case that we would discuss. What if you have both things at the same time? If the fanning was enough that it could fan the flames, in other words, make it to spread without having the wind, then he would be chayav. But if the fanning alone would not be sufficient, then he is exempt. Okay, now, one of the things that's interesting about this price is, I don't know how you would prove any of these things, right? How would you be able to say, he fanned it enough, he didn't fan it enough, right? So again, I think these are sometimes the type of prices that are a little bit more boundary pushing. They're not necessarily describing to us a real life example. And so then the Gemara says, Amai, right? Why is he exempt if the fanning wasn't sufficient? Lahavi kazora v'ruach misayato. Wouldn't we say it's the same case of somebody who winnows grain on Shabbat by throwing it in the air, and the wind assists him, by separating the chaff. So in other words, he's still he's liable for desecrating Shabbat, even though the wind helped him in the winnowing. Okay, say that quickly. Okay, so what does Abaye answer her? Ama Abaye, hacha b'maya skinan. What case are we trying to deal with here? Kagon sheliba mitzad achad v'libato haruach mitzad echad. So they make this thing like, let's say you have like a campfire, okay? And you basically have from one side, somebody's fanning it, and from the other side, the wind is coming. Okay, so therefore it's clear that the fanning couldn't have helped it spread. Rabba Amar, okay, kagon sheliba beruach mitzuya, v'libato haruach beruach sheina mitzuya. Rabba says we're dealing with a case where he fanned it with a typical wind. Okay, so it wasn't enough to make the fire spread. And then an atypical wind came and fanned it. So in other words, it started off with like a regular wind that wouldn't have made it spread, right? Regular breeze, I guess, that we see. And then sort of this really atypical wind came that made the fanning, even it made it capable to even spread more. Okay. And so therefore he couldn't have known that this atypical wind was going to come. So even though he was fanning it, his intention wasn't for it to spread. And therefore he still is going to be, he's going to be patur. And then finally, we say Rabbi Zera says, Amar, kagon t'marat samurai. Okay. So Rabbi Zera says we're dealing with a case where he only heated the fire by breathing on it. So in other words, this isn't even fanning. This would be when you go, right? And you try to make the fire greater. And then finally, Rav Ashi comes and says, right, Rav Ashi Amar, ki amrinan zoreh, beruach misayato, hani mileli in lan Shabbat, de melachat machshevet asra Torah. So when we say that somebody is chayav in a case with the winnowing and the wind, this only is a case with Hilchot Shabbat, okay? Because we're talking about the idea of Malachat Machshevet. So Malachat Machshevet is a concept that we have when it comes to Shabbat, which is the idea is that once the Torah prohibits something with Shabbat, okay, as long as that prohibited action is completed, it's as if that person did it, even though there might have been another factor that allowed him, in this case, the wind, right? That allowed that prohibited action to be completed, right? There's malachat machshavet. The idea was that that action was going to be completed, and so therefore that person is chayav when it comes to Hilchot Shabbat. But here in the case of damage with fire, grama ba'al makom, right? He damaged it through indirectly. Ugrama b'nezikin patur, and when it comes to indirect damage with damages, he is actually exempt. So I find this Gemara discussion to be fascinating because here we have this Mishnah that lists out 4 different factors of how we get damages. And then we have this Gemara that makes it even more complicated than what we saw, right? What if you were fanning it with wind? What if it's in different directions? What if it's in the same direction? What if he was fanning it and he knew that he wasn't going to be able to make it spread, but then a wind came that could make it spread? And I think finally sort of this punchline of the Gemara being that we understand that specifically with damages, we're not just talking about fire here, right? There is the possibility that sometimes there's indirect, right? There's indirect action, and we're not going to make people responsible for that. And I think that tells us something interesting sort of about the concept of damages in this world, right? The whole idea of nezikin, this whole idea of damages is, look, we inhabit the same world as other people, as animals, as objects, and people sort of move around. And sometimes we're just going to damage things, right? You're going to be chayav when you do something that's considered to be negligent or where you really should have considered, right, where my action is going to lead to a damage. But even with something like fire, which we know inherently is dangerous, if it's an indirect action, right, like you were fanning it, but then an atypical wind came, okay, we're not going to consider you to be chayav because that was really indirect. And so I think there's sort of this concept in the end of ugrama b'nezikin patur sort of says, we expect sort of a certain level of damages are just going to happen in the world just by us being there, right? It's indirect. We don't mean it to happen, and it's just going to happen. And we're going to be patur from those things. We have to allow sort of a certain type of movement in this world and a certain level of damage that's just going to take place. Okay, let's get to the second of 6 Mishnahs. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them. So now we have a case of somebody sends out fire. In other words, you weren't careful to make sure that it didn't spread, and it consumes wood, stones, or earth. He's chayav. Why? Because this is directly what the pasuk in Shemot, chapter 22, verse 5. This is all from Sefer Mishpatim, from Parsha Mishpatim. It directly talks about this, right? It says, Ki tetzei eish umitza'ah kotzim. Somebody lets a fire break out and it catches thorns, v'nechal gadish, right? Or a stack of grain, O hakama, or standing grain, O sadeh, or a field, shalem yishalem hamavir et habeirah. The one who kindles the fire has to pay the compensation. So the point of this Mishnah is to say, this is straightforward from the Torah. And I think we have to pay attention to this Mishnah because those of you who've been doing Daf Yomi for these past 4 years know, how common is it for a Mishnah to actually quote a pasuk? Usually not. Usually that's the Gemara's job, right? The Gemara comes, right? And the Gemara says, where do we learn this? Menahani mile. And it quotes the pasuk. I think part of what the Mishnah is trying to do here is to say, look, we gave you all the reasons out in the previous Mishnah, right? All the different factors. You gave it to the wrong person. There was a special wind came. There are all these factors that maybe could get you to be patur. But at the end of the day, this pasuk comes and says, if you are not careful and you are negligent with your fire and it burns something, you are going to be chayav. That's really the starting point. The starting point isn't where do you get to be patur. The starting point is really where do you get to be chayav with this? Okay, we'll just look at a little bit of the Gemara here. So one of the things that it does here that's interesting. Okay, if we go to the next, I'm just going to scroll down here to the next stuff. Okay, is it says that, so there's a very interesting passage that appears here. Before I get to that, I'm just going to see if there's any any questions here. Okay, yes, thank you for giving the words that I said here. Okay. So Baba Kama talks about, right, acts of heaven where you're liable in heaven but not in human courts and more are listed. Right. So this concept does appear in other places. If you want to look at something interesting, Hadron is doing a series actually with Dr. Alana Stein-Hain exactly on this concept. And I, urge you, she's done a lot of work on this concept. So definitely look into that. Okay. So the term liable in heaven is meant to tell us that Talmud law seems to defy common sense, then God will enact justice. There's a lot more to say about that. I think the idea is that, yes, technically you are not chayav, but you have to think as a person, right? Maybe you really are chayav. Maybe you still do have a liability, but we can't do it in the court system. Does that mean that it's a lack of common sense, or does it mean that the Beit Din of Shamayim holds us to a much higher standard? Okay, Lynn says here, maybe not liable in a Beit Din, but liable in the court of public opinion. Yep, that's one way to say that. Jay Fink says here, can this directly relate to events of the world today? Someone sets a fire with words of hate and followers that fan the flames. I think that is a great way to look at it. It's metaphorical, but I think very interesting today. And then finally, Lynn adds here as well, the passage is about the king having special dispensation from following the laws that apply to everyone else. So we're going to look at that passage that appears right here. So there's a very interesting passage here that talks about, and I don't really have time to read the whole thing, but it's this passage over here. Yatab Rav Ami Rav Asi Kamei de Rav Yitzchak Napcha. And what happens here is that Rav Ami and Rav Asi are sitting before Rav Yitzchak Napcha, and one of them says, I want you to teach me a halacha, and one of them says, I want you to teach me an agadata, right? I want you to teach me, not the straightforward halacha, but something metaphorical, something that I have to think about, something philosophical. They both fight with each other about it. And he basically says this funny mashal here where he says, I'm basically like a man with two wives, one who's old and one who's young. And the wife wants to pull out the white hairs of the husband so he looks younger. And the older wife wants to pull out the darker hairs, the black hairs, so the man appears older. And in the end, he turns out being bald. In other words, we're not going to accomplish anything if we keep fighting over what I should teach. And so he basically then teaches a halacha, right, where he goes through and he quotes this pasuk of ki tetzei ish umitza'am kotzim, and he gives an agadic interpretation to it and a halachic interpretation. Again, I apologize that I'm not reading it inside. You can follow along briefly with the English there. I'm just trying to get to a little bit more material. And what he basically says is the agadic, understanding of what this is that it's basically saying that when God set fire to the temple, right? When God decided that the temple needed to be destroyed because of our sins, God also what? Shalem yishalem. God is also responsible, and God has to pay restitution to the Jewish people. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, alay l'shalem et habe'ira shehivarti. Now, there's so much to think about this, right? The idea, and I think especially thinking about what's happening in today's world and the suffering that we're going through, that when God causes us suffering and causes us damages, at the same time, God says, what? I'm responsible for those damages. I owe the Jewish people restitution for those damages. Okay? And then from there, the Gemara gets into, right, it quotes Psukim to talk about how we know that fire, that God holds himself responsible for setting those fires. Then it goes to the halachic, the shmatata, right? And so it basically just, gives what's the halachic piece. And it says something very interesting about fire, right? Patacha katup b'nizikei mamon, right? The verse begins with damage that somebody causes one property, right? If a fire breaks out, b'siyem b'nizikei gufo. And it ends with damage that somebody causes one's body, right? Because it ends that verse with the one who kindles the fire. Lomar lach isho mishum chitzo. That what that tells you is the liability of fire is due to the similarity of eras. And again, the Gemara is teaching us something very interesting about fire. That when somebody has fire, it says equal to if somebody who shoots an arrow and causes, right? When you shoot an arrow, you're causing damage directly. The arrow pierces something. That is what fire is like. Fire has so much damage that it is equal to an arrow. Okay. And so I think we see, that this is a very interesting Agadata and Halacha that Rabbi Yitzchak Napcha wants to teach us. The Agadic piece being that God owes us restitution when God causes us damage. I want everyone to really sit and think about that. We don't have enough time to really go through that and process that. And then at the same time, the halachic piece is to say, fire is so dangerous that even, fire spreads by itself. You said it, it spreads by itself, it catches on something else. It's as damaging as if that you actually, cast shot an arrow and tried to intentionally damage somebody else. That's how dangerous that fire actually is. And then from here comes a very coded discussion that the Gemara gives of this case of David HaMelech, where David HaMelech basically goes and he says that he wants water, okay? And then he has these men who come and they draw water. Again, we don't have time to read it. They give 3, but the idea here is that David HaMelech is asking a specific question about damages with fire, okay? And I think this is one of these amazing passages that we have in the Gemara that actually is totally coded language, right? Probably what this was talking about is it's also talking about who's responsible for the damages that happen to people during war. And this may have been the Gemara's way of discussing what? The Romans, right? What do the Romans actually owe, or some of the damages that took place during their battles with Rome? They can't sort of write about it, just coming out with it, right? Is Rome responsible? What are the Jews allowed to do when they're fighting with Romans? Can they destroy other people's property? It gets into these halachic scenarios with fire during a time of war, and fire was probably used in a time of war as a type of, we know even 2023 it's used. I actually had the privilege this week of visiting the area and seeing, how, these houses were literally just burnt. So we know that fire is still used in times of war. And so I think it's interesting to see. I urge you to go back and look at this passage to see, how, this is sort of a coded text, right? This can't be that the Gemara really thinks that David HaMelech had a Sanhedrin that he went to and he asked a halachic question to. The Gemara is trying to really discuss something else. They're really trying to discuss the ethics of war, but in a way that other people reading, right, a non-Jew probably reading the text would not actually know. Okay. Let us move on from there. Okay, so we're going to go on to our next Mishnah, which is on 61a. We're not going to get to everything. I was overly ambitious today. Sorry about that. Okay, next Mishnah. Avra gader sheku gavo arbam amot o derech harabim o nahar pator. So the next Mishnah teaches us that if somebody kindles a fire and it crosses a fence that's 4 cubits high, or it goes through the reshut harabim, it goes through the public area, or the fire crosses a river, in those cases, he is actually exempt, okay? And that's an interesting, because the idea here is that there are certain barriers that should actually prevent fire from going through it. And if the fire doesn't prevent it, then again, that is like an act of God. We don't consider that to be sort of regular fire damage. I'm going to skip the Gemara here that I wanted to read here. We'll go on to the next Mishnah here. This is on 61b. And before we do that, I'm just going to check the chat here, okay, and see if anybody had anything to share. Okay. Aaron Boxer, I didn't think of it that way. Okay, I'm not sure what you were responding to, but okay. All right. Okay, so now we have our next Mishnah. Hamadlik b'toch shelo ad kama ta'abor hadleka. So now we say somebody lights a fire on his own property, right? You're allowed to light a fire on your own property. It's your property. And if it destroys something on your property, that's your problem, right? Up to what distance can the fire travel from in his property for him still to bear liability? In other words, is there a distance where we say it was far enough away or it traveled far enough that this also was sort of like farther than we would expect fire to travel? And therefore, it's sort of, again, it's sort of out of, this is an act of God. This isn't what we would expect to happen. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, so Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, so wherever the fire is, the location with the fire, we look at it as it's in the center of a beit core. The beit core is a measurement of land, okay? And basically what he's saying here is that if the fire spreads and causes damage more than half of a beit core, then he would be exempt. We don't expect a fire to be able to travel that well. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Sheish Esrei Amot. Rabbi Eliezer says more than 16 Amot, Kederach Reshut HaRabim, because that is the width of the public thoroughfare. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Chamishim Amot. Rabbi Akiva says 50 cubit feet. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Shalem Yishalem HaMavir Et HaBe'era, Hakol Lefi Hadleka. Rabbi Shimon comes and he says, wait, let's go back to the pasuk. And the pasuk says what? As long as you set the fire, what do? You actually have to pay. There's no safe distance at which somebody would not actually have to pay. And I think that's a very interesting opinion of Rabbi Shimon. First of all, he goes back and quotes the pasuk. And I think he's basically saying, right, that fire is just going to cause damage. You can't say that there's a safe amount of space that would make something not cause damage from it. All right, we'll just look at the beginning of the Gemara here. Right? So, are we basically saying, isn't Rabbi Shimon saying that there is a maximum limit, right? He's basically saying there's no maximum distance, right? And so then they quote a brisa here that says, okay, v'hatnan lo yamid adam tanur b'toch habayit. So from here, that's exactly the question that they're going to ask. They're going to quote a Mishnah here, and they're going to try to tease out, okay, could Rabbi Shimon actually have a measurement? Because when you read the Mishnah, it doesn't look like he has a measurement, but maybe he actually does have a measurement. So that's really what they're going to do with this particular Mishnah. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit over. I hope if you have to get off, you have to get off. Okay, let's go to the next Mishnah. Hamadlika Tagadish, okay, somebody who lights a stack of wheat or barley, Vayubo Kalim Videlku. And let's say inside that stack, there were hidden vessels. Now, this must have been something that people did, right? We now have, safes in our home, banks, you hide. This is like hiding something under your mattress, okay? So they would hide it in their stack of grain. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishalem Masha B'Tzacho, V'Chachamim Orim Eino Mishalem Ele Gadish Shel Chitin O Shel Seorim. So Rabbi Yehuda says you have to pay everything that was destroyed, right? So your bad luck that you lit something and it turns out there were a lot of kalim in that gadish, that's your problem, you have to pay it. And the chachamim say, no, you just assumed that there was only wheat or barley there, that's all that you're going to have to pay. Let's say there was a goat tied to the stack or a slave was nearby and they got burned with it, okay? Also, you will be chayav for that, okay? Evet kafutlo ugdi samuchlo b'nisrafimo patur. And now there's an interesting halacha that says, but if the slave was tied to the stack and the goat was nearby, okay, and they were burned together, then you are exempt, okay? Why are you exempt there? Because there you're actually chayav capital punishment. And so one of the things that we learned throughout Nizikin is that if you actually have to do a higher penalty, right? Like you deserve to die, you actually owe capital punishment, you don't pay any money that you owe. You only do the highest punishment that you have. Modim chachamim l'Rabbi Yehuda b'madlika tabira But the rabbis, right, who disagreed previously with Rabbi Yehuda, they agree with Rabbi Yehuda here that if somebody sets fire to a building, in that case, you pay everything because we assume in the building there have to be other objects, right? You just don't know. You can't just assume there's nothing in the building that's valuable. Right? Because people leave things, they actually leave things in their they leave things there. Okay. Now we'll just do the very beginning part of the Gemara here. Amar Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana says, "Machloka b'madlik b'toch shalo v'halcha b'achla b'toch shel chaveiro. The Rabbi Yehuda machayev anazike tamum be'esh v'Rabbanan patire." So Rav Kahana says that this machloka, this dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda about these hidden vessels that are in the stack is specifically a case where somebody lights a fire on his own property and the fire spread to somebody else's property. In that case, Rabbi Yehuda says, right? In that case, Rabbi Yehuda says, you are still chayav for something that's hidden, but the rabbis say you aren't. Aval madlik b'toch shel chaveiro. But if you light fire on your neighbor's property, divrei hakol meshalem kol ma shebetocho. Everybody, even the rabbis, are going to agree, of course you have to pay. You lit fire in somebody else's property. We don't care if something was hidden or not hidden. You never should have lit that fire there, okay? And that kind of logically really makes sense. The Gemara from there is going to go ahead and explore that opinion a little bit more, but I think the statement of Rav Kahana implicitly really makes a lot of sense to us. And finally, we'll get to the last Mishnah that mentions fire here. Let me just get to it. It's on 62b. Okay. A spark that comes from the hammer of a blacksmith and starts a fire and causes damage. Okay, the blacksmith is chaya for that. Now, the idea here is that these are the kind of sort of occupations that one needs to be very careful because by virtue of that occupation, you could cause a fire, and therefore there's kind of no level of negligence that actually is allowed. Gamal shayat ta'um pishtan. Let's say you have a camel that has flax on it. Flax is very flammable. Va'avar b'reshuta rabim, and it's in the b'reshuta rabim. V'nichmasa pishto l'toch hachanu v'dalka b'nei rosh hachan vayeh. And its flax was so wide it went past the hump of the back of the camel, and it actually stuck into a store. Now, probably we're not talking about the kind of stores that we're talking about today that we have today. These probably were more like little booths or something like that, okay, sort of out in the open a little bit. And what happened? It catches on fire because it got lit, right? V'hidlika tabira, and then it lights the whole building. Baal gamal chayav. The Baal gamal is chayav. So we saw this in the second Mishnah, right? If you have flammable material, you got to be careful with that flammable material. However, if the storekeeper keeps his candle outside where people are coming and going and animals, then he's going to be chayav. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'ner Chanukah patur. And this is a very interesting ending line, and the Gemara goes on to discuss this. He says, but if it was ner Chanukah, you're patur. If you were doing the ner as a mitzvah, you were patur. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about the Gemara and the Mishnah is there's no separate masachet about Chanukah, okay? The first time that we actually see Chanukah is in Masachet Shabbat, around pages 21 to 23. But we have sort of these little pieces scattered throughout the Gemara that give us the halachot of Chanukah, but we don't actually have a Masachet dedicated to it. So this is actually one of the places that discusses the halachot of Chanukah based off of the Mishnah. And the Gemara here actually talks about how high do the candles of Chanukah actually have to be, that they have to be 10 tefachim off the ground. And that's actually the Gemara that's here. Right. Thank you. Okay. A tefach is about this high. So 10 of these, 10 fistfuls, and that's what it has to be. Okay. So I'm going to end here. I know that I went a little bit over. Thank you for bearing with me. I'll check the chat. I think there was a lot to get through here. Interesting, again, to see how the Gemara deals with fire. I think fire is its unique category of damage. And I think at the end of the day, the halacha, the Gemara recognizes it's an arrow. It by itself, by its nature, fire is very, very dangerous, and therefore it's going to have its own set of damages or how damages are understood. Yet at the same time, we understand that there could be an act of nature that sort of indirectly or directly sort of makes the person's action, sort of literally combustible, right? It blows up and then they maybe wouldn't be chayav. So a very interesting category itself. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope I'll get to learn with you all soon.
Thank you, Dr. Osmond. So many interesting things you brought up here and so much you covered in 36
We covered a lot. I rushed. I'm
minutes.
sorry if I spoke too fast. Someone's going to complain.
An
Sorry about
auspicious
that.
number of minutes. And I just wanted to piggyback on the last thing. One thing I've noticed recently this year in reviewing the sources on Hanukkah, which I did last month when we were thinking about Hanukkah, is how often the rabbis describe the Hanukkah lights as being outside people's stalls and stores. We think of Hanukkah as lighting candles at home, but even in the medieval codes, you also see this. There's this idea that you're at market for the day and then you light the candles at dusk, wait for them to burn down, and then you go home, which is just a whole different way of enjoying Hanukkah with the community. Definitely not the main point here, but something I thought was interesting, so I draw our attention to. It's lovely to see you all. Happy New Year again. Mazel tov to all of us on tomorrow morning, arriving at the 4-year mark of this journey through Daf Yomi. Dr. Osmond, always a pleasure to learn from you. Thank you so much. Your comments, always appreciated, everybody. I learned from you too. And it was lovely to see you all. And we will see you here at the same time, same place next week.
Thank you, everybody.